Welcome to Flying Lessons for January 27th, 2011. Flying Lessons is a product of Mastery Flight Training Incorporated. Hi, I'm Tom Turner. Welcome to this week's edition of Flying Lessons Weekly. This week, we'll look at the risks and the rewards of touch-and-go landings. The touch-and-go is a staple of flight training. A landing with just enough time on the ground to reconfigure the airplane for another takeoff, the purpose of a touch-and-go is to compress more landings and takeoffs into a flying lesson. But given the high correlation between accidents and touch-and-go practice, are touch-and-goes worth the risk? To evaluate the risk level of flying touch-and-goes, as opposed to full stops, take a look at just what the pilot in command has to do in a very short period of time when flying a touch-and-go. 1. Directional control. A touch-and-go is a very workload-intensive maneuver, and often the pilot is overloaded to the point he or she does not adequately compensate for the winds or the turning tendencies of the airplane's spinning propeller. In many touch-and-go accidents, the airplane drifts into an obstacle in even very light surface winds. The touch-and-go pilot has to maintain directional control, starting with idle power, crosswind correcting as necessary control inputs of the flare, through the touchdown, and then counter torque during power reapplication and transition to initial climb. Directional control is usually lost not when the winds outblow the pilot's ability to correct, but when the pilot is distracted during takeoff or landing. Power. The touch-and-go pilot has to quickly and correctly manage the power controls to get full thrust for the takeoff portion of the maneuver. Power for most piston pilots consists of up to 4 control inputs: throttle, propeller speed, fuel mixture, and carburetor heat. All that potential flailing of hands in the cockpit can, and sometimes does, lead to undesirable results, especially at high density altitudes and/or in retractable gear airplanes. The thoughtful pilot realizes he or she can pre-configure some of the controls so as to not require movement during the short run on the ground. A variable pitch propeller control, for instance, can be placed to the full forward position on final approach, ready for the next takeoff without requiring movement on the ground. Same often goes for mixture control, depending on the engine type and the field elevation. 3. Flaps. Most pilots land with full or nearly full flaps and take off with little or no flaps extended. The change has to happen very quickly during a touch-and-go. The sequence of your actions, adding power first or retracting flaps, depends more on the airplane design, the speed of flap travel, and individual technique, but the sequence may be critical to safely taking off again. Many designs can't climb with full flaps extended, especially at high density altitudes, and other types will have seriously degraded climb performance. Some types, notably heavier, multi-engine airplanes, may not achieve acceptable climb performance without some amount of takeoff flap extension. Follow the pilot's operating handbook's advice, but more importantly, be certain it's the flap handle you're moving and not something else. 4. Trim. The amount of trim change from landing to takeoff may be negligible, or it may be substantial, but it will affect controllability and performance. Change the power and change the flap configuration, and chances are you'll have to change the airplane's trim. Regardless of the airplane, the trim will likely require at least some adjustment during a touch-and-go. Something more to do and yet another potential distraction in that very short period of time. Alternatives to the touch-and-go include performing only full-stop landings. This not only avoids the risk of touch-and-goes, it positively reinforces the proper sequence of events for both landing and takeoff. In fact, touch-and-goes tend to reinforce improper techniques, such as focusing inside and not outside the airplane during landing, cleaning up the airplane while still on the landing roll, and taking off without completing a takeoff checklist, things that can get a pilot into trouble when otherwise distracted. Another alternative is to perform stop-and-go landings, where the airplane is brought to a complete stop, calmly reconfigured for takeoff, and then makes a normal takeoff from the point where it stopped on landing. Do this only with adequate runway length and after coordination with air traffic control and/or other pilots at non-towered airports. A third alternative is to exercise cockpit management with a flight instructor. Assign him or her the tasks of reconfiguring the airplane, flaps, power except for throttle, and trim, so that you, the pilot flying, need only add power and fly the airplane. There's no doubt that touch and goes allow us to practice more takeoffs and landings per flight hour than a full stop landing and taxi back. More time spent in the flare and on takeoff means quicker, more economical flying lessons. In some parts of the globe, there are other financial inducements to touch and go landings by avoiding landing fees that are attached to full stop landing. Touch and go practice also prepares the advanced student or the certificated pilot for an emergency go-around technique should the need arise, such as when the pilot sees an object or an animal or another airplane on the runway, or finds he or she is unable to meet a land and hold short requirement. In my opinion, touch and go discipline should dictate touch and go practice only after the student pilot has mastered full stop landings and takeoffs, prohibiting primary students from flying the touch and go while flying solo, at least until very near the check ride preparation stage. Teaching touch and goes very carefully, emphasizing the technique as an emergency go-around maneuver. Prohibiting touch and go practice in all retractable gear airplanes except for such emergency training. Proper use of the instructor as a cockpit resource with a pre-briefed division of duties if conditions or the operating environment require touch and go practice. And prohibiting touch and go practice in tailwheel airplanes or any airplane at night. You can't log a touch and go as a landing for currency under those conditions anyway. Now, return to the Flying Lessons Weekly Report for the rest of this week's edition. If you don't already, you may subscribe to the free Flying Lessons Weekly Report on the Mastery Flight Training website.